Today we're going to continue in John chapters 9 and 10. But before we do, usually I've done a little bit of a review up to this point. And today we're not going to do that. It's going to take you can call it a rabbit trail, but I think it eventually will tie in. And most of you by now, I think everybody should have the second handout. You have a handout with a text and then a handout that has some pictures on it. It's called The Four Gospels and Ezekiel. And I put this together. Many of you may already have heard this analogy, but it was new to me, and I thought it was interesting. I was reading a little bit. Actually, I was listening to a speaker, I'll explain, talk about some of the differences between the four Gospels. And really wasn't relating it to this class at all. Just found it interesting. As one of the speakers we had at Sermon Seminar at Austin Grad when I worked there at one of our functions, Bruce McClarty, he was sharing about John, and he started out with this discussion about the four Gospels and the differences and the way different people categorize the differences. And there's a lot you could say. You could spend classes and classes on that. But one of the things he came to was way back, all the way 2nd century, a guy named Irenaeus, I don't know how you say his name, came up with the idea that the four Gospels equated to the four creatures or four faces in Ezekiel. And he has this long explanation I won't get into, but he says he has this famous quote that goes something like, there had to be four Gospels and only four Gospels. And he relates it to Ezekiel, these four faces. Now, not many people buy into this theory that Ezekiel was talking about the Gospels. The reason I mention it, though, it became a device or an image that has carried all the way for almost 2,000 years in Christian art. And so, and it's very prominent, as far as I could tell, in the Orthodox churches. Catholic, that's what I was going to ask you, Michelle. I don't know if you ever heard about this since attending the Episcopal Seminary. But he takes these four faces, one being the face of a human being, one a lion, one an ox, and one an eagle. And he goes through, and different readings about this, you can, if you haven't ever heard of this, you can read there's tons of literature on this. And most come up with a view that as listed on the paper, that Matthew represents the face of the man, that Mark is a lion, Luke is the calf or the ox, and John is the eagle. But there's even different differences on that. Some have different Gospels being different things. So obviously this isn't gospel. This is just theory. So, but there's lots of really deep discussions about how these images portray how the gospel is written. One of the things I wanted to share about this, though, I just enjoyed some of the stories McClarty was sharing. And it's a little bit of I won't say spoof, but it's kind of in jest, some of his things. And so if you've had a chance to look at this and you look at the images, and I know they're hard to read on this, but you can see, like in the top right hand, each of the images, the bottom right, for instance, the eagle, they're all holding a book. And that represents the Gospels. And some of you who are into Christian art, you may have seen, and I hadn't ever noticed, but because some cathedrals will have 4 quadrants in the ceiling. And it's not uncommon to have one represent each of these images in each of the Gospels. And the frescoes along the walls will match this. It'll be images from John. I see some of you shaking your head that you've heard this. Anyway, McClarty, to make the short thing longer, McClarty shares it this way, and he says, Matthew is a man, represents the image of a man. And he said, if you think about Matthew, it's kind of a gritty, down-to-earth gospel. Now, this is his word, so you can take this or leave it. But he says, this example I liked was, it includes things that you wouldn't necessarily include if you were writing it. Kind of like if your little brother or sister went to school and told all the family secrets. The genealogy has people in it that you might not include. And anyway, there's other little things in there that, it just, you kind of end up having to explain them to your neighbors kind of thing, Why is that in there? And then Mark, the voice of a lion, and is very fast paced. There, I think the word for immediate is 40, used 40 something times in there. Everything's, something happens. In John, it's like, and then they were walking, and you're in another section. In John, it's immediately after, and it moves. And I haven't studied this, but McClarty's he seems pretty accurate in the things he comes out with. He says Jesus acts more than he speaks in Mark, and when he acts, it's powerful. And so this idea of a roaring lion coming out. See, Luke, he used the image of an ox. It says in this one thing on the sheet, calf. It's kind of referred to both ways, ox or calf. Luke is very methodical. He even used the words kind of plods along, which that seems kind of negative, but it includes a lot. And so, for example, you go 70, 80 verses before you get to the birth, before there's a baby Jesus. And there's just a lot included. The example that Carolyn and I liked, we laughed about, because Carolyn, she was a nurse, and she worked for internists, a group of internists. And McClarty tells one of these preacher stories. I don't know if it's true or not, but he said he's sharing this one time, and a doctor comes running up to him. He was all excited. And he said, "I know what kind of doctor Luke was." He said, and this doctor was a surgeon. As a surgeon, you have to be quick, make quick decisions, get to the point. Internist will talk you to death because they get into every detail and go on. Well, those of you who know internists, they deal with all the complicated stuff, all the systems. And so anyway, Carolyn thought that was a pretty accurate description. Then you have John the eagle. Why all this? The main point is, I think this is a way to look at John. And John the eagle, and McClarty referred to him as the soaring eagle, the one that's flying 10,000 feet above. When you start the other Gospels, it's like starting an historical account. Starts with a birth, starts with a baptism, starts with Then you come to John, and you get, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. And later on, and the Word became flesh and dwelled among us, and we have seen his glory. You have this just wonderfully powerful image from way up above. And you see Jesus, the Son of God, the Creator, one with the Father, all of these big images. And so just as a counterpoint to what the point he's making there, and again, this is just an example, you can only take it so far. As I was thinking about this, you've got this huge, big picture, like I've mentioned, but you also have this incredibly intimate view of Jesus. I was thinking of, for instance, when we get to Jesus wept with Lazarus, we'll be getting into next week, and other passages where he just reveals so much about himself. And so wanted to share that for what it's worth. I just thought it was some of the stories were kind of funny, and it's kind of interesting to look into. I had no idea. There's just tons and tons of literature about this, about Ezekiel and the four Gospels, or the four messengers. So now we'll jump into 9 and 10. And if you remember in 7-8, at the end of 8, Jesus had gone up to Jerusalem during the Feast of Tabernacles early in the fall. And he'd had several interactions with the Pharisees and the Jews and the crowd. And it ended with a discussion about Abraham, where Jesus says, "Before Abraham was, I am." And the Jews were seeking to stone him and kill him again. And so now in chapter 9, we're still in Jerusalem. And it shifts scenes. This is starting in verse 1. As Jesus passed by, he saw a blind man from birth. And there's discussion with his disciples about, well, who sinned? He or his parents. And there was a time, we'll see a reference to something like this later, but there was a thought, and sometimes I think taught, I don't know if it was a prevalent thought, that if you were healthy and had prosperity, that reflected righteousness. And if you were in poverty and ill, that reflected sin. And so they asked, who sinned? And Jesus nukes this and says, no one sinned, so the works of God might be revealed. And so he anoints his eyes with mud, sends him to the pool of Siloam, where his sight is restored, again on the Sabbath, just like in chapter 5 with the healing of the invalid. And then we're going to skim parts of these so we can spend most of our time in 10. But The man is asked over the next number of verses 4 times by different groups, how were you healed? His neighbors see him. How were you healed? There's even a little question, this can't be the blind man that we know, just somebody that looks like him. And then he's taken to the Pharisees, and the Pharisees ask him, how did you receive your sight? And then there's an interesting, and again, I'm kind of skipping here, but the Pharisees become split on what's going on. Some say Jesus can't be from God. He doesn't keep the Sabbath. No one would do this on the Sabbath if he was from God. Others, now he's talking about the Pharisees, how can a sinner do such things? And just want to mention there, this is kind of a theme in John, that there's divisions over who Jesus is. And it's all groups, whether you'll see it, that it's the crowd, the general crowd, people around. It's the phrase he uses, the Jews, and you'll see this disagreement. And here you've got the Pharisees even disagreeing. And when we first became Christians, and you read all the stories about the Pharisees and Matthew and everything else, I had this just monolithic black and white view of the Pharisees. You know, they're all bad guys, they're all arrogant, and they're legalist, and they're, all this other stuff. John portrays people as people, and there were some, just like in any group, who had trouble or even just could not believe, would not believe. There were those who are confused. What is going on? This is not what I pictured, but there's something strange here. And then there are those who become believers right off the bat. And you see an example of that here. And we'll see more as we go through this. So then down in 18, the Jews couldn't even believe that he'd been blind. So they decided to talk to his parents. And his parents testify, yeah, this is our son. And yes, he was blind. And they ask him how he was healed. And they have an interesting response. Ask him, he's of age. And then it explains why they have that response. Because the persecution had already started. The Pharisees were threatening to put people out of the synagogue. Basically, we'd say excommunicate today, who followed Jesus. So they were afraid of being punished. So they said, ask him. I thought that's a real supportive parent. So then the Pharisees called the man in to question him again. They said, this man is a sinner, just referring to Jesus. And we have this famous quote, I think it's fairly famous, in verse 25, where the man says, whether he is a sinner, I do not know. But one thing I do know, I was blind, now I see. And again, for the 4th time, the Pharisees ask again, how did he do this? Just note this little phrase here. He said, I've told you already, but you would not listen. Why ask again? Do you want to become his disciples? Do you also want to become his disciples? I love this guy. You can picture him. He's described as a beggar. He'd been a beggar. Here he's in front of all the prestige of the Pharisees. He's in the synagogue and everything. And do you want to become disciples too? Well, you can imagine this infuriates the Pharisees. But it gets better. He says, we are disciples of Moses. We do not know where this man comes from. And his response, this is remarkable. You do not know, yet he opened my eyes. We know God does not listen to sinners, only those who worship him. Never has anyone opened the eyes of the blind. If he weren't from God, he couldn't do this. Well, you can read. You can imagine the response. You would teach us? And they threw him out. So it's interesting. The parents were pretty afraid of their position. This blind man, he just threw it all out there. He was, and obviously he had reason. He had nothing to lose, and he had already gained everything. So they cast him out. Now we're going to move into the section from 9:35 to 10:18. And Jesus finds him. Excuse me. Go ahead. Can you use a mic? Do we have a mic?
When it said, and they cast him out, do you interpret that to mean that they put him out of the synagogue?
That's what I do. I think most of the things I've read. Yeah. Sorry. Lawrence asked it, when they cast him out, does that mean they put him out of the synagogue? I think that would be because it ties in with what the parents were afraid of. I think I didn't chase that a whole lot, but good question. They were pretty upset, though, you could tell. So Jesus heard that they had cast him out in 35, and he found him. And so we have a conversation that goes on, and Dale and Michelle are going to read that. You do have a mic, right? Okay, let me, please. And Dale is Jesus, and Michelle is the narrator.
Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and having found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?"
He answered, "And who is he, sir, that I may believe in him?"
Jesus said to him, "You have seen him, and it is he who is speaking to you."
He said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshiped him.
Jesus said, "For judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind."
Some of the Pharisees heard these things and said to him, "Are we also blind?"
Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would have no guilt, but now that you say, 'We see,' your guilt remains. Truly, truly, I say to you, he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs in by another way, that man is a thief and a robber. But he who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. To him the gatekeeper opens. The sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he had brought out all his own, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. A stranger they will not follow, but they will flee from him, for they do not know the voice of strangers."
This figure of speech Jesus used with them, but they did not understand what he was saying to them.
So Jesus again said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. All who came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not listen to them. I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. He who is a hired hand and not a shepherd, who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees, and the wolf snatches them and scatters them. He flees because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. And I lay down my life for the sheep. And I have other sheep that are not of this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. So there will be one flock, one shepherd. For this reason the Father loves me, because I lay down my life, that I may take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I'll lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down, and I have authority to take it up again. This charge I have received from my Father."
There was again a division among the Jews because of these words. Many of them said, "He has a demon and is insane. Why listen to him?" Others said, "These are not the words of one who is oppressed by a demon. Can a demon open the eyes of the blind?"
I'd like to spend some time in discussion on this one. So well, first, I guess I'd say most of what I've read in terms of kind of breaking this down a little bit, in the first section where Jesus starts in 10:1, they refer to that as kind of a parable, down to verse 5. And then when he picks it up again in 7, this next section's kind of the application of the parable. I don't know if it's quite that clean, but it's one way to kind of break it down. And we also have, I just mentioned, we have our third and fourth I am metaphors here. We've had I am the bread, I am the light. Now we have I am the door or the gate, depending on your translation, and I am the good shepherd. Okay. Any immediate thoughts here? Gary. Maybe we can have the. What's
There
on
we
there?
go.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. One of the things that struck me during the reading was they asked the man who was given sight a question, and he said, no one could do this unless they come from God. And then in this parable and its application, a demon can't do this. It struck me because one of the obvious explanations that the people in power will give is that he does this by the power of Satan. And yet in this discussion, that's not considered an option. And it struck me, and just me, but apparently these people outside of our realm of experience actually felt like they had, and I believe they did have, experience with demons. They knew what a demon looked like, sort of. If you read the Gospels, there was a flavor that people identified as demonic. And yet when he said, when this is saying that a demon can't do this, we see no counter argument. Well, of course a demon could do this. So apparently what we're seeing here is they're conflicted based on their own experience about what God can and cannot do, and conversely, what Satan can and cannot do.
Thank you. That's a like that point. I hadn't really looked at it from that direction. That's a Michelle.
In verse 16 is when he gives the first hint of another flock that's going to be joined in with the flock. And I have other sheep that are not of this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. So there will be one flock, one shepherd. And I had not ever noticed that before. I forget about that when I read about who Jesus is talking to. He's talking to the Jews. And then here's this hint of, and there's going to be another flock I'm going to mix in with you, the Jews. So
that is really interesting. It's never expanded upon, or at least I don't see anything. And I wonder how much they would have gotten that, but I think they would have, because he's been talking about the flock.
It's interesting to note that LDS brethren cite this as justifying their existence as one flock.
Really?
Yeah.
I did not know that. Interesting. Hi, Zoomers, by the way. I see Mona, Doc, and Karen. Okay. Let's see. I had a few notes here. Let's see. Oh, verse 9. I'm going to be in 10 most time. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture. Now, this is a shepherd. He's bringing in the flock. Does that remind you of any particular passage? He will take the sheep. The shepherd will lead the sheep, and they will go in and out and find pasture. Maybe one of Danny's favorite psalms. Maybe the song that we sing. Yes, okay. Psalm 23. In and out of the pasture, because it's a good thing he's pointing out. The sheep is going to do this, and they will have life, and they will have life abundantly. And so I thought a really neat illustration. He says, "I am the good shepherd who lays down his life." Talks about thieves and robbers and hired hand. There's just one comment. See what y'all think. At first, when I read thieves and robbers, I thought, well, he's talking to the Pharisees. But the more I thought about it and looked at it, and a lot of people believe that, so they may be totally right. That might be totally right. But at the same time, he's talking about someone who comes in by another gate. and tries to lead the sheep astray. I'm not an expert on this, but there were a lot of people who came and said, "I'm the one." That was pretty common, and you could even read that into some of the comments that are made by others, about you're being the one, where you can't be the one. That was pretty common. So I wonder if he wasn't meaning that. Now the hired hands, I think that could be. Who knows? But just a thought. Now, in verse 14, he says, "I'm the good shepherd. I know my own. They know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father." You have kind of that movement that I was talking about a few weeks ago, where you've got the Father and I are one, same mind, and then Jesus starts moving it God through John, moving it toward the disciples being one with Jesus and with the Father. So now you've got I know my own and they know me. And then we'll get a little farther along here in the next section. But just to wrap up this thought, when Jesus talks to the Pharisees or to the Jews that are not believing, you don't know me. Basically, he says, you don't know my voice. And then he extends that. That would be one thing, but he extends that, so you don't know the Father. And that's pretty upsetting to hear that. So he's got this thing flowing through. Let's see if I have one more. Okay. Yeah, we have enough time. Cheryl, you want to share a story? About a month ago, we talked about that, a little over a month ago on Wednesday night. We talked just kind of general observations of John. And Cheryl had a story from her childhood that related to this passage. And it's kind of fun, and it's a good illustration too. So I asked if she would share a few minutes. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, I was sharing a story about my mother's sister that lived closest to us, was really just about 10 miles from our house out in the country. And I loved to go out there and visit and play with her dogs and her cats and this, that, and the other. Didn't like the chickens so much. They pecked at me, but the turkey was the main problem, and I got chased up on a fence post one time by him and was out there screaming for help for a long time. And finally, one of the family came out and, oh goodness, and got him away. I couldn't go over on the other side of the fence because that's where the ram was, and I would have been butted across the field. But I was talking too about one of the best memories I had out there. My uncle, my aunt Onvi's husband, the word that comes to mind is irascible. He was a curmudgeon, and all of us kids steered at least a 5-foot berth away from him, because if you forgot and walked anywhere close, he would reach out and just pinch you just out of pure meanness, and then just laugh and think that was so funny. And I said, and the animals could tell that was his nature, because when they finally quit raising turkeys, thank heavens, and started raising sheep, Andy would say, Archie, I need to finish cooking dinner. You go out there and call in the sheep. That never went well. He'd get out there, and when he did his yell, that they all knew what he wanted, they'd just hold their heads up and look at him, and then go back to whatever they were doing, because they didn't want to come anywhere near him. He was they could tell he was not a kind person. So finally, he'd have to go back in and say, oh, they won't come. And then she would go out and she would call for them, and immediately they would perk up and start just trotting toward her, because she had a kind voice and a kind nature, and they associated that with her and loved her for it, and they would come quickly. They recognized the voice that took care of them and loved them.
Thank you. Isn't it a great practical illustration? I mean, and it's so true too. There's a lot. I think that's thinking about that. I think that I've seen that so many times with my wife with Carolyn and kids in particular, but usually all people, kids just gravitate because of that, just with the acceptance and voice and care. And they run when I come. But so we could spend lots more time on this section, but since we have about 7 minutes left, any other final comments on this section? And then we'll. Really powerful lesson here. Okay, so in 19, we'll go over this fairly quick. Let me turn my page here. Just wanted to touch base. It was red, but again, there was a division among the Jews. As Gary mentioned, he has a demon. He's insane. Why listen to him? These are not the words of one who's oppressed by a demon. I'd never thought about that. They definitely had a picture of what a demon was and could do. So that's glad you mentioned that. So you've got this again, this back and forth between the groups that are running into Jesus. So now we move at the time to the Feast of Dedication, which took place. And as I mentioned last week, this happened in December. And so we had the Feast of Tabernacles in early fall, and all these things that happened, and now we're moving up to December. We're within, 4 months or so of the final Passover and the cross. Let's see here. So Jesus is walking in the temple, and the Jews ask him, "How long will you keep us in suspense? Are you the Christ?" And Jesus says, "I told you, but you do not believe." Remember when the blind man who was no longer blind said that? "I told you before, but you didn't believe. So do you want to become disciples?" Jesus doesn't say that, but you do not believe. Let me move my page. I thought it was interesting that it was almost the exact same phrase. He goes into the works I do bear witness, but you do not believe, since you are not my sheep. My sheep, here we get back to the same language. My sheep hear my voice. I know them, and they follow me. I give them eternal life, and they will never perish. My Father has given to them to me. He is greater than all. No one will be able to snatch them out of my hand. And again, the inference is, you don't hear my voice. You are not my sheep. You don't know the Father. So what do the Jews do? They pick up stones to stone him again. And Jesus asks him, "Well, I've done many good works. For which one of these do you stone me for?" Isn't that? He just has them in circles. Not for good works, but for blasphemy, making yourself God. And then there's this passage that I'm still a little clueless about. I'm clueless about a lot of things, but this one. Jesus says, "Is it not written in your law, you are gods?" And he says, basically, if Scripture calls, in Scripture, God called men gods. How do you condemn it when the Father consecrated and sent me into the world? Calls me his own, basically. If I'm not doing the works of the Father, don't believe me. If I am, believe the works, that you may know the Father is in me and I'm in the Father. So again, they tried to arrest him and he escaped again. This "you are gods." Have any of you studied this? I just think that's a interesting phrase. What I found was Psalm 82:6, and this is God speaking. It said, "I said, you are gods. You are sons of the Most High." And what I could find, the little I could find on this, and I didn't spend a huge amount of time. Most people think that this was a reference to, he was speaking to those who had been appointed, like judges or administrators, people who made decisions on behalf of the people, and had been appointed by God. So in a sense, small letter, they were gods. I couldn't find much else on that. Just interesting. Any thoughts? Gary said that he was surprised that he called, if that is from Psalm 82:6, if that's a reference, that he called that part of the law.
He said, your law.
Oh, he said your law.
Yeah. Is it not written in your
that Michelle said your law, emphasis on your.
Not
Interesting.
the law,
Not
but
the
your
law. Interesting. Okay, your assignment for next week is to figure out what that means and come back.
Well, I mean, they turned 10 commandments into 611 commandments.
They turned, Michelle said, they turned 10 commandments into 611. Yeah. So we wrap up. He went away again across the Jordan, and many came to him, and many believed. So things are happening. I just end again today, unless anybody has final. Well, I'll offer anybody a chance for a final comment. Again, throughout this back and forth, you have these words of encouragement and comfort that I think you can find. And just a few is, to those of you who believed, you will be saved. You will go in and out and find pasture. And when I think of that, I think of how Danny's described Psalm 23 and Shalom. Just that rest, the good life, the full life. You will have life and have it abundantly. You will know me and know the Father. Again, you will have eternal life. And no one, and he repeats this twice, no one will ever be able to take it away. And that's cool. That has to be comforting. Any final thoughts? If not, next week we will move into Lazarus and then chapter 12. Thank you.